I did discuss the dissolution of an internal service fund in the last video. Again, you might want to consider what's happening within an internal service fund. We would likely have not only any type of machinery or equipment, capital asset type items inside an internal service fund in order to provide the goods or services that a particular ISF would be providing, but we would also have built up what in essence is like retained earnings for a business, because their whole point of being self-sufficient, they would have hopefully revenues greater than expenses or cost, and their revenues are their billings to departments. And we have what is called excess of net billings to departments over cost. So again, it's like retained earnings that's built up over and over and over. And so there would likely be not only some capital assets, machinery and equipment type things to either transfer over or liquidate into cash, but we would also have excess of net billings that has built up. Again, that could be within our cash, but it's the excess of that net position in there. So go back and watch the tail end of that particular video, the prior one to this, if you want to hear some more about the dissolution. But let's move on and talk about the governing body versus fund management. We could have some conflicts between the two parties because the internal service fund managers want freedom. They want to be able to operate their particular fund like a business. They want to be able to make their own decisions regarding how the revenues are brought in and how the costs and expenses get reflected. But the legislators also want control. Think about it from an accountability standpoint, but also think about it from the fact that they want to be reelected. Alright, so due to the fact that the governmental funds, the departments and programs who utilize internal service funds actually still have to submit budget line items to the legislative body, and when they do that, they even have to include what they are going to be getting or obtaining from these internal service funds, then in essence these legislative folks do still have control because they've got to approve the budget and make those appropriations possible. Alright, so even though the internal service fund management and legislators are somewhat at conflict, it's still built into the budgetary process. In regards to any ISFs that may have manufacturing activities at their core, think of the fact that if it was a manufacturing entity, then they have got to use accounting mechanisms to provide adequate information, not only for management purposes, but of course for reporting purposes. So if we happen to have a continuous process of manufacturing of some sort, then they need to be utilizing process cost accounting accounts. If it's job order type of a process, or not a process, but if it's a job order type of activity, then they need to be using job order cost accounts. And if the government can find a way to use standard costing, then they need to do that. Alright, so get the engineers and the management involved and come up with a way to do standard costing, what things should be costing per unit in regards to such things as direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. And then be able to do variance analysis. Did they underperform or did they do well? Alright, so measurement and reporting needs to be part of it if there are manufacturing activities. And lastly, Governments can actually use internal service funds as areas to control financing and insurance activities. Think of how many types of things a government needs to have insurance for. Not only for their property, plant, and equipment type items, but also such things as workman's comp. Let's see, I've got a list somewhere. Workman's comp, health insurance, that's always a big one. And then again, property and casualty. Those are just some of the things that a government's got to be able to handle. Alright, so we can use an ISF not only to purchase insurance, but we can also use an internal service fund to use it to purchase equipment for the government, for the different departments and funds. We can use it for the centralized operations like we've talked about. We can use it for even finance and risk management. If it's used for purchasing of equipment, depreciation expense will apply, and depending on how it's set up, they can even include an upcharge on top of that regular depreciation that would be calculated. In essence, trying to cover future expected increases in replacing those assets. So in other words, they're building it in a little at a time for the government to be able to replace those assets. So really what they're doing is they're incorporating it into the current appropriations and budget for replacing an asset right now that's being utilized. When an internal service fund is utilized for risk financing and insurance purposes, like I mentioned, health insurance, property and casualty, workman's comp, GASB wants them to handle the accounting and reporting just so. They need to basically handle it in the same manner as what a public business entity would do. Revenues and expenses, claims and liabilities need to be handled. When a claim is asserted, it needs to be done a certain way. What about impairment that's experienced? Those need to be handled a certain way. When a liability is actually incurred, again, keep in mind reasonably estimated, likelihood, all of those things that you guys have definitely covered in your prior intermediate classes. Again, these types of things would be within the financial statements. We would also need to have things disclosed within our notes. And some of that information is a little bit beyond the scope of what we are doing in this 4,000 level class, but my graduate level class will be required to do some additional things. Again, it's all about what we show in the financial reports to those users, both internal and external, that are important to track.